The Eternal Lonely Day. By Star Scribe. Chapter 4. Take a little trip, 20 AE. Whenever Alex was stressed, she went to her garden. She hadn't had a talent for it before the event. She had killed everything she touched back then, in the days when she had fingers and toes on the end of her limbs instead of hooves. Magic had changed that, much as it had changed everything. Alex's little home was located in downtown Alexandria, and was one of the few homes with enough of the expensive real estate to have a garden out back. Oliver had done most of the planting, though he rarely had the time to tend the garden anymore. Ever since Alex had retired from her office as mayor, she'd had a lot more free time. More time to read, more time to work with the HPI, and more time for gardening. "I'm sorry," Alex said to the weeds, resting a hoof against the stem of a huge mustard. "But you can't live in here. This soil is for my garden." Under her persuasion, the roots relaxed their grip on the soil, and she was able to tear them easily from the ground and toss them into her wheelbarrow wagon. She would take them out of town when she was done, to let them take root in empty soil. Thus was her agreement with the weeds. "Don't you ever say I don't take good care of you," she said to her tomatoes, brushing against the plant with her side. "We both know you'd have been eaten by ants by now without my help." The tomatoes said nothing, but Alex could feel their gratitude. It was enough. She smelled arithmetic coming before she saw him, the sweat of summer and the musk of a healthy stallion and the exhaust fumes of biodiesel. Gone were the days of 12 years of public school education. Arithmetic was an apprentice at the biofuel plant, and he brought the stench of chemicals with him. She heard the squeak of the gate and turned, stepping out from between the rows and grinning at him. Cody had grown tall, like his father, though he had his mother's mane. Like most ponies these days, he wore little in terms of clothes. Just a lab coat she knew wasn't for show, cut so as to reveal the beaker and drawing compass he had for a cutie mark. "Afternoon, Mother." He met her hug, though there was a measure of awkwardness to it. He wasn't just taller, but older. He looked more like her older brother than her son. Alex didn't care what things looked like, she knew better. "You reek. What is it today?" "Sodium hydroxide, like most days." He sighed. "You'd think there would be a spell for the smell. One day." She let him break away, not wanting Cody to feel any more awkward than he already did. It might be the last time she saw him for weeks, after all. Did the funding meeting go well? She didn't even need him to open his mouth to see the answer written in his body. His ears flattened and his tail tucked in. "I'm sorry. They're so stupid." This time, he was the one that reached out to embrace her, not the other way around. "No vision. Our plant isn't sustainable and every pony knows it. Our power needs are increasing by 10% every single year. We can't keep ramping up production like this, or in 10 years no pony is going to have anything to eat." Not to mention, of course, he did mention it. He went on and on. Alex didn't listen because she understood she didn't. Rather, she listened because she loved her son and she loved her city. She understood the basics. The city was getting its electrical power from wind turbines and steam. Every year the steam turbines got less reliable, and precision-manufactured replacement parts simply weren't available. That meant that more and more of their needs were being met with primitive steam generators, burning farm waste and construction waste. But it doesn't work forever. We can't get enough farm waste to run everything forever. It's only the ruins of old buildings keeping everything running. You have to put energy into the system from somewhere, and the sun just isn't keeping up." He continued, explaining his solution in a level of detail that went way over Alex's head. "Against such stupidity the very gods themselves contend in vain," Alex supplied. Cody stopped ranting, staring openly. Alex just shrugged. "How much money would you need to get your project funded?" He sighed, patting her on the back. "I know you want to help, but it's more than you have, Mom." He was right. Alex's disposable income was almost non-existent. Granted, money itself was a fairly new thing in Alexandria. Other settlements had their own answers, but Alexandria used the electronic meal chits out of Raven City. They were just plastic, but they were also impossible for any pony to fabricate. Plus, they had a commodity value, since they could be traded back to the HPI in exchange for new electronics or even meal rations. Alex had made a fair amount of them during her time as mayor. She didn't leave them fluid, though. Alex had invested every chit. Investment was a sensible choice when your lifespan stretched into perpetuity. Unfortunately, that meant she lived in the closest thing to poverty in the short term. She had another source of income, however. How much would it take if you could get the prototype manufactured for free? Arithmetic stopped, his expression twisting into his concentration face. She stifled a giggle with a hoof, since she knew that would stop him from taking her seriously. Eventually he said, "My funding request was for 10,000 chits. I could probably, 3,000? We would still need to get the enchantments done, and to hire enough Pegasus ponies to move the clouds. Could you get your funding approved for that much?" He nodded. "Easily. If I already had a working prototype, even without the enchantments, there's no way they wouldn't. And you've got blueprints? Sketches?" He nodded again. "Get them to me. I'll get you your prototype. Though, if your sketches aren't perfect, you're gonna get some angry phone calls." "Phone calls?" He raised his eyebrows. "Not visits from a messenger?" "Nope." She nodded. "I've got friends with hands. They'll use the phone. Though for something really important, they visit." She grinned, though the subject was more bittersweet than anything. "I'm expecting a visit this evening, actually." He tensed, glancing fearfully over the plants and out to the sidewalk as though he expected an HPI field scout in full armor. He wouldn't have been far wrong, if it wasn't for the fact that HPI visits only came at night. "They're coming today. After dinner." She turned away, back towards her garden. "Get me the designs. I'll see what I can do about your prototype." Several hours later, after Oliver came home from the hospital, after Alex served dinner and she said her farewells, she stepped out onto the cool of the porch to wait. She had already donned her vest, as well as the cyber gauntlet, its plastic yellowed with age. Of course, she didn't need the gauntlet to hear her old friend coming. It wasn't Taylor's fault, wearing 100 pounds of armor hardly made it easy to move silently. Hydraulic servos whooshed and buzzed with every step, though even that wasn't the first thing she felt. Her first sense of Taylor's approach was the sense of nothingness approaching from the street. Most ponies couldn't sense the imprint of a CPNFG closer than 20 feet or so. Alex's senses were better, largely from exposure. Since her retirement, she had spent more time around CPNFGs than any other pony she knew of. Alex clicked the door locked behind her, then hopped down onto the path through her garden. The weight of her sear, standard equine rifle, seemed heavy on her shoulder, despite being made mostly from plastic. The weight came from the fact she might be using it tonight. Even so, her smile was genuine as she looked up towards Taylor Gamble. HPI Field Scout armor had grown significantly bulkier over the years, so much so that power support had been incorporated. Of course, the weight had been added for good reason. Field Scout armor had the latest in CPNFG designs, small and efficient enough that a nuclear reactor was not required. It was like living inside a walking submarine, but at least you weren't tethered to a reactor. "Evening, Taylor." She waved. Her friend raised an arm, waving back. "Hey tiny horse. How's life in the big city?" It was pretty dead at night. Amber street lights burned in the city's center, but very few were out and about who didn't have bat wings. Ponies were diurnal, few fought their natural rhythms forever. Alex herself relied on her supernatural endurance to not feel tired. She shrugged. "Same as always. Bigger and bigger every day." Taylor wasn't a young woman anymore. Though Alex's appearance hadn't changed in the slightest, the human behind the armor was in her 40s now. Both of them had been parents, though only Taylor looked it. She still acted much the same, even 20 years later. She reached down to pat Alex's head with a glove, something Alex did not allow from just anyone. "You'll be building skyscrapers in no time." Alex shrugged. "Probably not. Skyscrapers don't make much economic sense when land is so." She trailed off. "You don't care?" "Not really." She laughed. Her voice didn't sound so strangely modulated as it had through earlier versions of the armor. It was still being electronically reproduced, but she appreciated the improvements to the system. Most of all, she appreciated the clear helmet that let her see Taylor's face. This was intentional, the HPI's way of showing whatever pony stumbled upon them in the field that they were indeed human. "Big night tonight. You ready for a long flight? You know how much I love hummingbirds." "Not today." Taylor gestured, and they started walking together down the street, human and pony alike. "Albatross." Alex felt her eyebrows go up. "Really? That serious?" Taylor nodded gravely, and there was no smile on her face then. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Alex wasn't surprised to find another of her non-human friends waiting with the albatross outside of town. She rarely saw Blacklight under any other circumstances, as occupied as she was with the concerns of her brood. Typically whenever Blacklight wanted anything done in town, she used one of her numerous drones. They were like the drones used by the HPI, with one meaningful difference: they were alive. Sapient? She was never quite sure on that point. She could see a half-dozen or so of the changelings Blacklight called drones, standing at attention as though creatures of perfect discipline. Lonely Day had tried to figure out before which drones were intelligent and which weren't. Just over 100 of them worked throughout Alexandria as helpers and assistants and caretakers to the young or elderly. She greeted Blacklight with a hug, looking up and up and up into her face. To see her now, there was no doubt at all in Alex's mind that she was talking to a queen. Blacklight towered over ordinary ponies, her body lean and elegant and her mind vast. Blacklight had been a little girl once. There was still a little of that in there somewhere. It wasn't as though anything had happened to erase that person. Rather, it might be said that the rest of her had grown so much that the human she had been was eclipsed. "Late night for a pony." Blacklight's voice echoed strangely, just as it always had. "Taylor only gets me for important things." She grinned. "You too. You usually send drones, but you don't often come along. Aren't you needed in your hive?" "My daughter's skills are sufficient for an evening." She gestured vaguely out into the wilderness. Alex knew she was looking at her hive, about a dozen miles away. "How is little Ivali these days?" "I don't think I've seen her since last Christmas." Alex nearly jumped out of her skin when one of the drones answered before Riley could. It spoke with a child's intonations, though like all adult drones it had an adult, vaguely female voice. "I'm great, Lonely Day. I'm so glad you asked. Mother thinks I'll be ready to find a male next spring if I'm lucky. Have you seen any?" It took her several seconds to collect herself enough to respond. She wasn't entirely sure what the distant nymph queen meant, but she had a fair idea. "None in Alexandria. I hear there are more changelings on the east coast. Maybe you can convince one of their males to join you." Alex knew little about how things really worked for the changelings. Riley had been her good friend all the way through childhood. She had grown up at a frighteningly accelerated pace, looking larger and older than herself after about a year. Once she had found herself a mate of her own species. Riley had grown reticent about the specifics of her differences. She had remained in the colony for nearly a decade, but spoken little about what her new family was like. Alex was one of the few ponies that had ever been inside the large mansion she'd claimed just outside the city, or the even bigger industrial complex after that. Even after visiting, she hadn't really felt like she knew. What she had learned, she had learned from spending time with Blacklight's young daughter, Ivali. This conversation is useful, Blacklight interrupted. We will continue at a later time, Ivali. Day and I must travel or we may not arrive in time. She gestured to the ship, and as one the drones, including the one that had spoken a few moments before, turned and marched into the open belly of the albatross. Taylor was already gone, and that left only the two of them. Alex had to hurry to keep up with Blacklight's long, graceful strides. Will she really be ready by spring? The queen beside her hesitated. I am uncertain. If she were a drone, she would have matured years ago. She smiled, and for once Lonely Day recognized the expression perfectly. It was exactly the expression she might have worn, if she were talking about arithmetic. Ivali fancies herself a queen already. She spends night after night fantasizing about establishing her own hive somewhere. She insists she wants it to be just like mine. Cooperation with Alexandria has allowed us to grow strong, and she would like to grow strong as the partner of some other city. More ponies are sorely needed. Alex tried to mask her hesitation. If Blacklight noticed, she did not react. Yes, they are. We are not many yet not all of us have cooperated so well with ponies. I sometimes speak with other queens. Some have hostile mindsets. I do not wish Ivali to become like them. Alex made herself sound joking when she responded, but she wasn't really. The laughter did not reach her eyes. She had no illusions about being able to fool the changeling queen. She couldn't even lie successfully to her son, let alone a being that literally fed on emotions. You don't imagine a world ruled by changelings? Your dependence on emotions means you couldn't ever replace them, but you're strong. You could try if you wanted. They climbed the ramp. The albatross was fantastically large, longer than most houses and taller too. It would have dwarfed a 757 several times over. Alex knew it rose well above most of the trees here. What trees there were! Only the elemental might of its thorium reactor generated enough energy to keep such a monster airborne. Queen Blacklight went only so far as the ramp before she stopped, looking thoughtful. When she spoke, it was with obvious deliberation. As though she wanted to be honest, but was afraid of the consequences if she did. There are some who think that way. I might have myself, if it wasn't for Adrian. If it wasn't for you. I think hostility or control would undermine everything that has made us successful so far. I think if we gave ponies a reason to fight, they could drive us to extinction if they wanted. There are not many, but some of the queens pretend to control. They imagine us superior to those who had been made ponies. Our superiority, they suggest, gives us the right to Earth. Yet we aren't really in control. Who would love us if we tried to force ourselves on ponies? Who would respect us, who would be amused with us, and all the other food we need? No pony. If there is a way to force food from a pony, none of the others have learned it yet. Threaten a pony's life and you can get her to say whatever you want, do whatever you want. But without sincerity, it isn't food. Ponies have to mean it or we can't eat it. That means only two options. Either we lie, and deceive ponies into thinking we're some pony else. Like the equestrian changelings did, Alex supplied. She hadn't known that 20 years ago, before she had read the library. Now she had read every book, and remembered each perfectly. Including all the little obscure details and hints, which she could now connect and correlate between each volume if she wanted. Like them. Riley shook her head in disgust. Or we could find a more optimal solution. Here in Alexandria, I think I've found it. Make friends with ponies, send the drones to be obedient helpers wherever help is needed. Visit often, cooperate. Become so indispensable to the city that they cannot help but love you. You didn't have to do all that for me to love you. Alex rested her head gently on the queen's side. There had been a time when she had been taller, and could stroke Riley's wispy mane. Not anymore. You've been a friend since we found you. You saved my life, and many others. Maybe even the world. Riley did not pull away from the contact. Where showing physical affection with political leaders might have been a ludicrous concept in the human world, it was more than desirable here. One of the little secrets Alex had learned but never mentioned was that Blacklight could make far more use of her affection than any other pony. A single gesture from her could go further than the adoration of an entire crowd. Lonely Day didn't understand why, but she didn't really care. What did it cost her to be kind? The albatross was airborne. Alex had been so enraptured with the conversation, she hadn't even noticed the change. It was Taylor's voice over the paw that liberated her from her reverie. It's going to be over an hour to Los Angeles, she began. But if it's the same to you, I'd like to get the briefing out of the way. Well, same to you, Alex. Riley has already heard it. Or I would not have come. Yeah, that. Taylor sounded annoyed. Why don't we all meet in the conference room? We can plan from there. On our way. Alex rose, walking past Blacklight with clanking hoof steps. She spoke much lower, almost in a whisper. Guess we probably should. Yes. The Queen rose. Together they made their way to the briefing room. Alex was not enthusiastic about whatever mission was serious enough to require their resident changeling queen. Yet, if she had to do something dangerous, she could think of few ponies she would rather have at her back than Taylor and Riley. Even if, technically, neither of them were ponies. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. And you're sure this is safe? Alex had to scream over the rush of air from outside. It wasn't the sound of motion, their albatross carrier was holding steady in its perch, resisting the gale at about a mile of altitude. Alex indicated the harness on her back with a flick of her head. Taylor had strapped it down tightly, a set of hard plastic saddlebags that had replaced her usual gear. It had a weighty, expensive feel to it, the body as black as the night outside. She couldn't even count the straps that were holding it to her. It felt secure, but she loathed the idea of having to remove it without a unicorn's help. The EADH has been extensively tested. Taylor wasn't at the controls but standing close, near the open ramp. She was secured with sturdy cable clipped to the ceiling, though one arm was tight on the handholds. You could be a block of pony-shaped lead and it would still put you down in one piece. Alex went over the controls in her mind again, the lengths of control cable on each of her forelegs. One would deploy her chute, the other would blow the explosives on the emergency chute. Alex had been skydiving before, decades and decades ago. But that had been before the event, a single tandem jump with an instructor. Instead of an instructor, her companions were a changeling queen and half a dozen drones. The hardware was already on the ground, along with the captured ponies. In theory they were going to be the cleanup crew, preparing the living ponies beneath for containment and extraction. In reality, there was no way to know for certain if enemies had managed to escape detection. She might be dead in 5 minutes. What would it feel like to hit ground without a parachute? How long would it take her to wake up? Lonely Day banished the thought with a shiver, edging towards the opening and the howling wind beyond. Her steps were unsteady even with the rough surface, but she never stumbled. As she advanced, a changeling stood beside her, using its own weight to keep her steady through every faltering movement. She stood on the edge of the void. Even with night vision goggles over her eyes casting the world in green, she saw nothing beyond but emptiness. Her legs started to shake and she nearly collapsed, her whole body buzzing with frightened energy. "I'll help you down," Riley shouted from beside her. The changeling wore nothing but a very large rifle slung over her back, secured so it wouldn't be swept away when she jumped. "No parachute, no armor. I won't let anything happen to you. I'll be fine," she shouted back. "Just push me." There was no hesitation, no counting to 3. Blacklight shoved hard, and Alex went tumbling out into the void. She screamed, the air stole her breath. She kicked and flailed and somersaulted through the air. What way was up? Where was the albatross? She might have lost control of her bladder at some point. If she had, the air stole that too. She vaguely felt movement behind her, saw a faint glow come upon her accompanied by a loud beeping sound from her goggles indicating the presence of thermic radiation. Her wild motion in the air was swiftly replaced by a more guided, directional plummet. She was moving down. In the air beside her, she saw a flash of black and clear wings, and Black Light's grinning face. Or had it been a drone? It was hard to tell even without the air blasting in her eyes. Her fall couldn't have lasted that long, even though her fear had. Her earpiece squawked with a synthesized voice. Reached designated deployment altitude. Something exploded from behind her. First came a minor tugging, and a second later she jerked painfully backward against her harness. The straps groaned against the weight of her body but held in the end. She was dimly conscious of servos behind her, guiding the parachute down towards its programmed destination. Alex let herself hang limply in her restraints, watching the altitude drop in her HUD and bracing herself for a landing. She didn't really need it. As she got closer to the earth, she felt strength radiating up towards her, strengthening her and making her feel awake again. Where are you, Earth? She saw it in her mind, a graveyard of ruined buildings in the distance and rolling desert hills before her. The computer guidance within her vest directed her towards empty ground. Alex did not roll as she struck, though she had been told to. She landed on her hooves, and suddenly couldn't get at the memory of what she was supposed to do. Her limbs might have broken from the shock, probably would have if she hadn't been an earth pony. Instead, Lonely Day called upon the strength of the earth. A single moment stretched into a little infinity, and her perception changed. Far, far below, she felt the beating heart of the planet, an unimaginably vast mass of molten temperature metal compressed into solidity by incomprehensible pressures. Further up, columns of semi-molten rock flowed in inexorable currents, moving sometimes slower than her perceptions and in other times much faster. Further still she found the stones, some hundreds of millions of years old. Lonely Day took in the endurance of those stones. Her bones briefly hardened like steel, her tissues becoming as rigid as crystallized carbon. The frozen moment passed. Instead of bones breaking, the ground she had struck exploded outward in a crater of loose sand and dust. Lonely Day knew of no other pony who could call upon the planet as swiftly or as completely as she could, just as she knew of no healer as skilled as Oliver. When the earth gave you a blessing, it was yours. Forever. Behind her, something landed on the soil. She smiled as she saw Black Light. Impressive landing, Alex said, over the faint whirring of servos as her parachute retracted. Practice. Black Light gestured, and her drones landed on the ground beside them. Ready. She didn't feel ready. Yet as she let the earth flow into her, even her resolve returned. As I'll ever be. She didn't unclip the equine airborne deployment harness, preferring to keep its armored form about her, but she did detach the rifle and sling it where it was within easy reach. I am now. Then we have work to do. A little ways up a hill, and Alex could see the signs of battle. The ground was blackened and scarred, and here and there she saw the wreckage of a drone, or a dark bloodstain on the soil. There were no bodies. Alex was grateful for the night. Even with it, she could make out the familiar outlines of her city in the distance. The skyscrapers of downtown looked much as they had, at least in the distance. She wondered how bad the damage from the fire had been. Closer, she realized with some horror that she was already within the area that had once been the city. Fire had consumed much, but here and there she saw a length of pipe or the wreckage of a car emerging from the desert. 20 years had taken the wreckage of a flame-consumed neighborhood and swallowed them. Had she not known what to look for, she might not have known where she was. Why do you think the fight happened out here? Riley did not seem to hesitate before answering. But then, she almost never did. They must have been on the move. They finished whatever purpose they'd been put to in the city and started walking to their next destination. Across the desert. She shivered involuntarily. It's almost summer. There's no water. It had to have been 100 degrees. The queen shrugged. Those captured by Abaddon are less than drones to them. My drones are my children, and I long for each to grow into themselves. Abaddon do not care. They view their supply of slaves as endless and grow stronger from their suffering. How do you know? She couldn't read Blacklight's expression. I remember. Our origin is similar. Both of us are unwelcome in the world of matter and form. We the changelings of Equestria, I mean, they came because they wanted to be a part of it. Abaddon came to destroy what they could not have. They will unravel every thread in the tapestry. You are welcome always, my daughter. Archive's words were not her own. She did not resist. Your children also, they are of me. Blacklight did not seem confused. Though she met Alex's eyes, Alex had the feeling the changeling queen was seeing through her. Blacklight was more than used to speaking through others. Thank you, Keeper, she lowered her head reverently. Were those tears in her eyes? It's like, however, we will not abide. The abomination rises to new atrocities. If we locate this one tonight, we will not merely destroy it as we did the last. We will make it suffer first. There will be penance for its debauchery. Lonely Day wished she knew what the voice meant when it spoke with her mouth. What debauchery? What was it talking about? She soon learned. They found ponies first, surrounded by a protective circle of security drones. Each one had an electric collar about its neck. They're sedated, Taylor explained. The new antithomic compound I told you about. Magic requires conscious stimulation to be effective. When exposed to thermic radiation, the compound breaks down into several powerful sedatives. The more magic they try to do, the more sleepy they get. I will not be able to recover them in unconsciousness. Blacklight's voice seemed unmoved by the wreckage of battle. They must choose freedom or I cannot give it. Taylor's voice came through clear. I know. Don't do it yet. They're not the reason I brought you. I could have had one of the construction bots scoop them up into a shipping crate and fly it to Alexandria. They're only secondary to your being here. When we get to it, I want to see you do it. Alex's voice was tentative. I need to know how. Blacklight raised an eyebrow. Well, she looked like she would have. If she'd had any. A mere pony couldn't help them. No amount of repetition will teach you. Not if they were human. She spoke with confidence now. Those are mine. You've got to show me how you do it. Blacklight shrugged. No harm in watching. But, not yet. She moved forward again, and Alex followed. Around them, drones both organic and mechanical watched the movement of every tree, the swaying of every blade of grass. Her own eyes, weak in darkness, saw clearly with the help of her goggles. Every patch of heat glowed to her eyes. She'd had no idea just how warm changelings were until tonight. She supposed it had been bias on her part to expect anything else. It wasn't long before they came upon the reason for their mission. You're near the corpses. There are a few live specimens further on. She saw them. There was no heat in the corpses, though she realized with growing horror she recognized what she was looking at. They were human. No, that wasn't quite right. They had been. Foul fluid pooled beneath them, a soup whose color she could not distinguish through the uniform green and blue of her goggles. Limbs didn't so much rot away as they crumbled away, as though they were made from sand instead of flesh. Through the strange decomposition, Alex could yet make out more troubling details. Though humanoid in principal shape, the corpses had no hair on their heads, which had become bulbous and elongated. The eyes were much larger, and the fingers appeared webbed. Strange membranes or cilia emerged from the mouth, out from very sharp teeth that seemed more filed than transformed. It was hard to tell, but the corpses seemed to have more limbs than they should. Tentacle-like manipulating appendages protruded from various points on the chest. The number and location of these appendages was not consistent between them. What is this? Archive did not need to be instructed to say those words, she felt them herself. Rage boiled in her chest, but she forced it down. Rage would not serve her until the need to be clear-headed had passed. We found them this way, Taylor responded over the radio. We have never seen anything like it. Despite the frightful state of those bodies, they were alive this morning. We can't do a serious analysis ourselves, Commander Clark is afraid their mutations might spread. This isn't what happens when humans are exposed to the thermic field. Alex was not asking a question. No. It wasn't the human on the radio who answered, but the changeling at her side. I would guess these beings live and function perfectly well outside any artificial protection. See for yourself. Take a look at that large container, the one surrounded by Class 1 drones. I'll have one of them switch the lights on when you get close. It was like watching a car accident, horrified at what she knew was coming but unable to look away. Lonely Day put one hoof in front of the other until she had passed the rapidly rotting bodies, gone from dirt to many times cracked cement, and come to stand beside the container. She felt much better to have the watchful eyes of a dozen drones upon her, both living and artificial. The IFF chip in her cyber gauntlet would protect her if the drones started shooting. The container proved to be fairly small, about 7 feet square. Alex couldn't have guessed where they got a clear container of that size made of plexiglass, but she didn't feel the need to ask. Rather, the breath was stolen from her lungs as the lights were switched on and she saw what was inside. Lonely Day had long since grown accustomed to the twinge of fear that came from spending time with changelings. All ponies felt it at first, enough that some rare few even fled or reacted with hostility upon first encountering one that wasn't pretending to be some pony else. That was why, in Alexandria, changeling visitors always pretended to be ponies. It did wonders for their public image, and only when in private with those who really understood, like this moment, did they reveal their true selves. What she felt upon seeing these creatures was far worse. It was the same feeling, but an order of magnitude greater in intensity. Alex tensed, but her rational mind would not bow to the pressure to flee. She dug her hooves into the ground and forced herself to see. She wished they were dead. They stuck wetly to the side of their tank, with tattered rags clinging to their bodies. The extra limbs held them to the glass, though even their human limbs didn't look quite right. She saw no hair on their bodies, and their eyes were utterly black. If there was intelligence somewhere, she couldn't see it. It was impossible to guess what race they had been, though they were all now unnaturally pale. She saw veins pulsing through the skin in places, never the same between each individual. There are 6 of these creatures. Blacklight's voice was measured. There are very few of you in your shelter, yes? I understand you have a scheduled breeding program that prevents the expansion of your population. And that no member has ever been unaccounted for. This much at least, she said in a respectful, approving tone. Yet, Taylor didn't hesitate. We've lost people on missions, but we always recover the bodies. Human corpses must be burned. None have been unaccounted for. We wouldn't let that happen to one of our own. Is this what happens to corpses? No. Her voice was firm. Nothing so consistent as this. More importantly, they do not respond unless other sapient life is within their physical perception. My drones have been watching these for hours. They tried to get out, tried working together to break the container. I was never present, but they've remained biologically active this entire time. Alex looked away, yet in the corpse of her city she could find no respite. Dead buildings reminded her of the dead, millions and billions in number, that had been buried there. What about the people chilling in morgues and hospitals all over the country at the moment of the event? Why had she never heard about this? I never heard about bodies doing anything but rot. We've found a few, mostly bones. They just look like dead humans. Now Taylor's voice came halting. It doesn't happen to the people who died before the collapse. It doesn't seem to happen to everybody, either. Nor does it happen to anyone who dies and is kept within the CPNFG. But, in the early days, before we improved the technology, a few died to magical exposure, when their suits failed. Ponies were usually involved. There are no records because the ponies usually died too. We recovered their SUTCAM files remotely. When we did, we sterilized the area with drones. We have no record of any sapient creature ever surviving an encounter with them. Taylor sighed. We didn't think it would happen again. Our thermic armor is 2 generations more sophisticated. We can walk around in Alexandria for God's sake, so long as we stay away from that university and nobody tries to levitate us or whatever. It hasn't happened. As I said, we incinerate the dead. I know it's hard to see, but look. They've all got uniforms, see? She didn't want to turn around, but she did anyway. Sure enough, she could see some common traits to the fabric, each stained so thoroughly with filth their color was lost. Yet Archive's memory was perfect now, and she didn't need very much to tell what she was looking at. Those are naval uniforms. She walked around the tank. One of the creatures tracked her with dead eyes, none of the others bothered. They belong to this one still has a patch. She froze. Archive recognized it. Taylor. I need you to tell me that there were no other organizations like yours before the event. I need you to tell me nobody else could build the CPNFG. I need you to tell me and for it to be true.